Are victims of the Troubles about to see any remaining hopes for justice come to an end?
The current system for dealing with the legacy of the Troubles is not working.
The British government is planning what amounts to an amnesty for all who committed murder during the conflict, and an end to all types of court cases aimed at uncovering the truth about the Troubles.
This idea, I think, that you can reach the criminal threshold for some of these incidents has always been, for me, a bit of a lie, really, that's been propagated on the people of Northern Ireland.
But is this a done deal?
I would say that it's fairly certain the UK will face a variety of legal challenges.
For many, the UK government now stands accused of preparing to side with killers over victims.
Drawing a line under this, it only benefits the perpetrators, and we get nothing from that. No victims get anything from it. It's solely, we lose everything and they have everything to gain from this.
A graveyard can be a lonely place. Pam Morrison experienced more tragedy than most during the Troubles. The conflict decimated her family.
It had a terrible effect on the family, and we never talked about it because you couldn't talk about it. You were just that numb, you couldn't talk about it.
Pam was one of 8 brothers and sisters in the Graham family, growing up in Lisnaskea in Fermanagh.
My mum always stopped at home. My dad worked on the railway. We used to play around the fields and that, and we gather nuts and apples and that around the orchards, and we had a very happy life.
When the Troubles erupted, 4 of her siblings became part-time members of the Ulster Defence Regiment.
It was always a worry any time they went out. It was always a worry till you knew they'd come back safe.
In 1979, Pam's sister Hilary died from injuries years earlier. She had been hit by a car at a UDR checkpoint. A tragic accident. Over the next 6 years, 3 of her brothers were murdered by the IRA in separate incidents. All were targeted off-duty.
Ronnie was my first brother. He was murdered on the 5th of June, 81. He was aged 39. Cecil was my second brother. He was shot at on the 9th of November, 81, and he died on the 11th of November, 81. 2 days after his injuries. He was 32 years of age. Jimmy had to go out to Derlin School to collect the youngsters to take them to the Lakeland Forum and then a skill to do swimming. Then the next thing they opened up fire on him in the bus. We don't really know what damages he had to his body. Got the remains home, but nobody was allowed to identify him. That had an awful effect on the family, on his wife and family.
Sorry.
All 3 men were married with young children. The Graham family believed they knew the names of some of those involved, but no one was ever convicted. Pam knows the chances of justice now are slim, but she feels the fear of justice should always hang over the killers for what they did to her family.
It has been a very lonely life without them because we were so close, and it makes no difference how many years it is. The older you get, the worse it gets, I think. It's just a very lonely life. You just have to learn to live your life without them, and it's a very hard life without them.
The peace process has never found a way to deliver some form of truth or justice for Pam Morrison, or for the other victims of the Troubles. Now, the British government says it's time to accept that justice for Troubles killings, stretching back decades, is largely unachievable. It's proposing sweeping legislation that would stop Troubles-related investigations, inquests, civil court cases, and the criminal pursuit of killers. And that means telling victims to accept that no one will ever be held accountable for murder. The Good Friday Agreement included early prisoner releases, demilitarisation, decommissioning, and police reform. But no mechanism for truth and justice or reconciliation over the past.
Why are these people allowed in this room? Remove them now. We are the victims. We're the victims. Everybody's a victim.
Attempts to find a way forward have often opened wounds rather than healed them. Legacy issues have become an extension of the conflict. In 2014, the Stormont House Agreement finally seemed to offer a solution, backed by the UK, Ireland, and all the main political parties here. But it was never put into action.
The Stormont House Agreement wasn't implemented because with time there was too much of a backlash against it, particularly among unionists and former members of the security forces.
In the absence of a truth and justice process, victims have taken action themselves, getting old inquests reopened and seeking redress in the courts. There are now more than 1,000 Troubles-related civil cases underway, and they are largely suing the British state.
I think the increased volume of cases of litigation helps put a spotlight onto the role of the government in general terms, but specifically its various agencies and the intelligence agencies, whether that be police, military, MOD, undercover units. Those agencies are now dragged into a legal process that probably the government never thought would ever happen. And back in the day, it's my view that when the government was assessing conflict-related issues, it was solely in the context of criminal investigations. We now have a completely different landscape. In my view, the battleground on the narrative of the past has shifted into the courts, the civil courts in particular.
Renewed investigations in the civil courts and elsewhere have changed the landscape, often by bringing new information to light. And that began to have real-world consequences, including for former servants of the state. Over the past 10 years, a spate of cases involving former soldiers has been brought to court, charging veterans in relation to incidents that happened decades ago. They were a fraction of the Troubles-related cases coming to court, but enough to get the government's attention. Dennis Hutchings died in October this year, while on trial in Belfast over a 1974 killing. When he was first charged 6 years ago, the news brought former soldiers onto the streets.
Margaret Thatcher would turn in her grave. She would turn in her grave to see what is happening to her boys today.
Robin Horsfall is a former member of the SAS.
It seemed to them that it was a betrayal. Everyone had hoped that the Good Friday Agreement would draw a line under this and life would move on for everybody. But this was an attack through what we've described as lawfare, using the courts to discredit the British government's actions and the actions of the military in Northern Ireland in the 70s, 80s and 90s.
Veterans argued soldiers who served in Northern Ireland were being unfairly pursued. They took their campaign to the door of Number 10.
We openly supported Boris Johnson's campaign for the leadership. Then after that, we continued to remind him that these were promises he made during his during the Conservative Party victory at the last general election, included a promise that he would stop the persecution and prosecution of British soldiers who had served in Northern Ireland.
Former Defence Minister Johnny Mercer was among the Tory MPs listening to the campaign. He supported Dennis Hutchings when the veteran was on trial in connection with the killing of John Pat Cunningham in Tyrone.
In Dennis's case, you know, a young unarmed man died and was shot by the British Army. That is unacceptable. That is wrong. The question is, how do we deal with that now?
He believed Hutchings was innocent, but says soldiers should be held accountable for any wrongdoing when there is categorical evidence. He and his party also argue it is time to accept that such evidence doesn't exist in most of these cases.
Are we ever going to get a criminal threshold of proof in order to make an allegation such as the ones that were given to Dennis Hutchings stick? And the answer is no. But this idea, I think, that you can reach the criminal threshold for some of these incidents has always been, for me, a bit of a lie, really, that's been propagated on the people of Northern Ireland.
The 2019 Conservative Party manifesto promised to protect veterans from prosecutions. The problem for veterans and the government was it became clear that legally such protection from prosecution couldn't be granted to former soldiers without the provision also being extended to paramilitaries. Robin Horsfall says he and other veterans can live with that.
I think it would be a really cruel person that didn't sympathise with people wanting justice when their members of their family have been murdered. Well, we had one remit, one agenda, one mission, and that was to stop the prosecution, the unfair prosecutions of soldiers.
It is clear that the current system for dealing with the legacy of the Troubles is not working. It is now a difficult, in fact a painful truth, that the focus on criminal investigations is increasingly unlikely to deliver successful criminal justice outcomes. But all the while, it continues to divide communities and it fails to obtain answers for a majority of victims and families.
During the summer, the government said it would bring forward legislation, including plans for a truth and information retrieval process, a history of the conflict, and a statute of limitations. This would draw a line under all criminal investigations into the conflict and effectively create an amnesty for all Troubles-related offences.
We acknowledge that any proposal that moves away from criminal justice outcomes would be a very significant step that will be extremely difficult for some families to accept.
A recent poll conducted by the Commission for Victims and Survivors suggested 70% of the Northern Ireland public are against the idea. And victims groups and local political parties are united in opposition, albeit for sometimes different reasons. For Sinn Féin, the law would let the British state off the hook.
The British state have nowhere else to turn, and rather to face up to their human rights obligations to victims, they are now poised to wreak havoc on the legal system here, rather than face up to the consequences of their dirty war. The legacy proposals to deny families any legal redress to justice is a statement of moral bankruptcy.
For Unionists, it would mean terrorists getting away with their crimes.
Rather than find an answer to this difficult and sensitive question, the Secretary of State seems to have chosen a path which finds equivalence between the soldier and the police officer and those who planted the bomb or pulled the trigger. This, Mr. Speaker, is morally reprehensible.
For many victims, the quest for answers now spans generations. This is the case for Patricia Burns and her daughter Alana.
It's been a struggle watching her fight for something that just seems like we're not going to get. It's so far out of reach. I've seen mental health issues be passed down from them to us. It's a struggle. It's anxiety, stress.
Alana's grandfather, Tommy Burns, was a 32-year-old married father of 4 from North Belfast, a Catholic who served in the Royal Navy.
My daddy, he joined the Navy when he was 15 or 16, and he travelled all around the place. He met my mummy when he was about 18. When they first got married, my daddy was posted to Singapore.
10 years later, the Burns settled back in the Old Park area.
I remember sitting at the door and I always waited for my big daddy, because to me he was just a big daddy. He was so tall. And I always remember having a close bond with him. And we were a close-knit, happy wee family. We mightn't have had much, but it was a happy home. We were all happy together. And then that all changed.
On the night of July 12, 1972, Tommy and friends were in a social club, a minute's walk from his home. There was an army post nearby and gunfire, so they stayed in the venue late until the shooting had stopped.
The shooting lulled. So what would have happened then if they were leaving, anyone was leaving the social club, they would have shouted up to the army and the army post, you know, turn the lights off, don't be making us a target. But apparently they shone the light right at the door, and there was a couple of shots rang out and one hit my daddy fatally and killed him.
It was a soldier who fired the shot. The Royal Military Police, not the RUC, took primacy in investigating the death. The army said Tommy was a gunman. An inquest said this was death by misadventure. The case was closed.
The army internally investigated it, and there was no investigation whatsoever.
For decades, the Burns family have fought to clear Tommy's name. In 2015, an historical inquiries team report concluded that death was a tragedy which shouldn't have happened. Tommy was not a gunman, and the army and RUC investigations were ineffective. A soldier accused of firing the fatal shot refused to talk to the HET. There has been no army or government apology, no new police investigation, and a request for a new inquest was turned down on the grounds too much time had passed.
It's disgusting. It's hurtful. I mean, it wouldn't happen anywhere else in the world. Nobody would get shot dead, know who shot them, and never be investigated. It just wouldn't happen.
The PSNI told us Tommy Burns' shooting is due to be reviewed by its Legacy Investigation Branch, but it regrettably has a backlog of cases. Patricia says she owes it not just to her father, but also to her mother, to continue pursuing the truth.
Well, we went from being a normal family, 2 parents, 4 children, just a normal life, and overnight we just changed. My mummy never got to grieve for what happened. She was left, she was a homemaker, so once my daddy died, she had no time to grieve. She had to get up, get a job, 2 jobs, and like she worked her fingers to the bone to rear us. The day he died, I think my mummy died inside too.
Despite the government plans for an amnesty, the Burns family say they won't give up the legal fight.
Drawing a line under this, it only benefits the perpetrators, and we get nothing from that. No victims get anything from it. It's solely, we lose everything and they have everything to gain from this.
It just breaks my heart because we've never seen any investigation, any admission of guilt, nothing. So how do you put that away? Why are the army above the law? Why are they not compelled to be answerable for what they've done? Our whole family have suffered for years because of not only what happened, the lies told afterwards.
the Ministry of Defence said it would be inappropriate to comment on the case because it's defending a civil claim brought by the Burns family. After the government announced its legacy plan, the Burns went to court to seek a judicial review of the legality of the proposed legislation. 2 weeks ago, a judge turned down their case because the draft legislation hasn't yet been published. But he also said he expected there may yet be what he called a judicial aversion to the amnesty plan, an apparent indication that the government's big idea may not sit well with the courts when the legislation emerges. Professor Louise Mallender is an expert in human rights and international law. She has studied amnesties in conflicts around the world and has serious concerns about the UK government proposals.
When I look at the proposals introduced here in the UK, I find it shocking that a democratic rule of law state would rule out accountability for killings or torture or really serious violations. And so this goes much further than what I've seen elsewhere around the world.
United Nations experts and international human rights groups have warned the proposals could breach the UK's duty to protect life and investigate murder.
If the government proceeds with enacting legislation which runs contrary to rule of law principles and the UK's obligations under international human rights law, I would say that it's fairly certain the UK will face a variety of legal challenges, both before the domestic courts in the UK in the form of judicial review, but also the European Court of Human Rights.
If the legislation goes ahead as outlined, the British government will not just be shutting down criminal cases, but all inquests, civil actions and judicial reviews involving the Troubles. Kevin Winters believes the idea is to silence the courts, which have been exposing state collusion and cases like the Ballymurphy massacre.
I think the British government traditionally is always very keen to promote the idea that statistically no more than 10% of killings were directly attributable to the security forces, and that the other 90% in whatever division was attributable to Republican and Loyalist killers. I think it's now increasingly wrong to make that assessment. I think the lines are so much more blurred, and one of the reasons for that is families accessing the courts and challenging the state on its role.
Others argue the government has been pushed into its position because they say legacy has been politicised and used to attack it.
I think the fear, as far as the government concerned, is that if we shut the door on criminal lawfare, that then organisations like Sinn Féin will simply carry on the narrative through the civil courts, which is just perpetuating the enmity, the animosity.
From all sides, the legacy issue is beset by different political agendas, parties and groups protecting their own interests. And caught in the middle are the victims. Unionists have also made political capital out of the legacy battle, says Ben Lowry. But he believes the fact the state can be held accountable in a way the IRA cannot is a key factor.
One of the obvious reasons for that is that the security forces have records, had records and have records, and the paramilitaries don't have records, so there's a paper trail to the security forces. If prosecutions are not stopped, it will be the security forces who are most vulnerable to trials.
Sinn Féin says its opposition to the amnesty is based on human rights concerns. But Ben Lowry suggests the current process of investigation is preferable to the party because it doesn't put many former paramilitaries in court and keeps the focus on the British state.
I can't know what Republicans are thinking, but you could deduce that Republicans are so confident that the process will be worse for the state, the UK state, than it will be for them, is why they are saying that they are outraged about this proposal.
However, Kevin Winters says Republicans could also be secretly relieved if the courts are closed down. because he's now taking on many cases on behalf of ex-security force members that he claims will expose how deeply the IRA was controlled by the British intelligence services. Something Republicans would not want to see examined in court.
I think it's fair to say that a lot of political parties have been to the forefront in condemning this proposal. But on reflection, if there is a shutdown, it's not just the British government who are likely to benefit from that, and especially when we look at allegations of Republican state collusion.
Sinn Féin said it has to be asked who gains most from the proposals. It said thousands of Republicans and Loyalists were jailed during the Troubles, but only a handful of British soldiers. For its part, the UK government insists its proposed legislation will comply with international law and human rights. Rather than closing down access to information, it says its plans will ensure that more information will be publicly available through a new independent information recovery process. It says it will never accept any moral equivalence between those who upheld the law and those on all sides who sought to destroy it. For victims like Pam Morrison, the prospect of an amnesty is heartbreaking. As a member of victims group South East Fermanagh Foundation, she spent time creating quilts to remember her brothers and others murdered during the Troubles.
And get them levelled out so it sits right. Because you can't have them all a mess, you have to have them right.
Members of the group have had meetings with Tory MPs at Westminster to make their case against the amnesty. They will return for more meetings in London next week.
If there's sufficient evidence to convict somebody for such a crime, the law is the law. So therefore it should be, if they do a crime, well, they've got to do the time for it.
The government is expected to publish draft legislation in Parliament soon. With a big majority, there is every prospect it will easily push its plans through. But the vote will not be a cut and dry issue for some Tories. While he's an ex-soldier and has campaigned to protect veterans in cases he feels are unfair, Johnny Mercer is not convinced about both an amnesty and silencing the courts.
As a UK government, we have to accept some of the things the British Army did in Northern Ireland were unacceptable. I have never, ever, in my 7 years in politics, ever advocated for an amnesty. I have never advocated for a time bar to prevent prosecution. All I've ever advocated for is fairness, and I cannot make it any clearer than that. So what the government has brought forward, essentially, is cutting off pathways to justice for British citizens who were, whether they were killed by the British Army or indeed by the IRA, right? It is cutting off the opportunity to see justice for them, and I think that is a huge step. It puts me in a very, very difficult position, and I haven't decided what I'll do yet.
Whatever happens next, lawyers and victims have warned this will not end with a vote in Parliament. As for the Burns family, they are appealing the decision not to grant them a judicial review of the government's proposals.
People are saying forget about it. I can't forget about it. I can't. How can you forget about something that was so tragic and so wrong and nothing was ever investigated about it? You just can't do it.
All it's doing is just kicking this further down the line and causing more damage to people's lives and waiting for people to die off.
No, it doesn't get any easier. According as the years goes on, I think the older you get, the worse it gets. It's there with you, something that never leaves you. You've just got to live with it.
How then have you managed to keep going?
Probably maybe through my faith or something, like, you've got to keep going on. There's nothing else for it. You have got to keep going on.